definitely been a topic that is sort of closer to my heart as of late, because only recently in the last couple of years have I been able to start having my own garden. I haven't really lived in any apartments or places that that gave me that opportunity, but over the last couple of years I've sort of been doing everything that I can and experimenting with different plants, and I've had sort of different evolutions of my garden, so I'm very excited to talk about it, and to kind of just explain my experiences. So yeah, I'll go ahead and get started. So from humble beginnings, this was from a couple of years ago. Was the first time that that I had a patio that could really hold plants. It wasn't the best of conditions because it was where I lived was on the second floor, and my entire unit was shrouded by oak trees. So I had very, very low light situations. So that kind of limited what I could grow. So I had some bromeliads and some peperomia and not a whole lot else. Um, but it sort of gave me sort of let me get my feet wet into the whole container gardening scene. And once I moved apartments again, I had a lot more versatility in what I could grow. I had a smaller patio, but at least there was a whole lot more sun exposure. And it's really cool because in this current patio that I have this sort of, if you can see there, kind of like a concrete wall that juts out and makes a little alcove, and on either side of the balcony. So I have like a little shady enclosure that I can kind of hunker in all of my shade plants. And then of course by the grate I can plant all my sunny stuff. And just a couple pictures so you guys can see. These are very old pictures, some of the older pictures, but some of the ones that I still like to show. And then as we get into it, you'll see some more recent pictures. So the first things I wanted to talk about were the basics. So the sort of factors that come into play when you're trying to figure out what you can grow and how successful everything's going to be. And we'll talk about sun exposure, the soil composition, watering frequency, and also the species selection. So one thing that I always like to say with container gardening is that because you can control all of these different factors to an extent, it really opens up the door to a whole lot of other species opportunities. So, you can grow different kinds of wetland plants right next to your pot of, azure sage or other like really dry type plants, because you're able to control all these factors. And that's kind of the allure. That's kind of the excitement that I've had, is that I get to try these different things and see how they react in pots, and sort of see how everything reacts. So, and I have my own situation. I live in an apartment, and I'm fairly high up. I'm on the sixth floor, so my wildlife interactivity is fairly limited. I don't get a whole lot of anything. Unfortunately, I do get a handful of pollinators, and sometimes I bring home caterpillars and put them on my own host plants, or bring home another host plant, just to give myself a little bit of a competitive edge, if you will. But in a traditional sort of scenario where you're either just out on your patio in your home, or you have sort of a closer touch to nature, you'll start to see even in container gardening those wildlife come in and sort of interact with the plants that you've got on your in your garden. So what I wanted to do first is go through a couple of slides, just kind of showing sort of some of the diversity of plants that I've got, that I've had success with in the sunny side, in my sunny side up. So I have a handful of different things: shrubs, wildflowers, things like that. And as I'll get into a little bit later, these are primarily things that are going to stay relatively well behaved in containers. Nothing that's going to get overly, that's going to grow too fast, going to grow too big. So things are going to be fairly well kept. So things like my wild strawberry, the azure sage, or even a celestial lily, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Things that do well in the sun. So a lot of wildflowers, a couple different types of shrubs are fairly well behaved in pots. And that's primarily what that is composed of. And then I have a couple of herbs and things like that. Then I also have my shady characters. This is everything that doesn't require a whole lot of sun. And I kind of have these hunkered down. And you'll notice I have a couple of different like stands that I've bought, just to kind of give the areas some levels and a little bit of unique allure. And I'll get into a whole lot of other types of plants there, but primarily ferns. Peperomias are really easy to grow. I believe there's also a violet down there, a couple other plants, but these are very easy to maintain, pretty low maintenance in the shady areas. They don't grow fast. They don't require as much watering frequency. So those are definitely easy to go as well. So the first thing we'll talk about is we'll give everyone the dirt on the soil, as I like to say. My favorite mix is something that I'm a little privileged to have access to, because this is the nursery's kind of pride and joy soil, which is a kind of composted pine mix that we have custom mixed with about 20% sand. So that gives us a little bit more accurate of a medium. When we grow out plants, in containers, we still want stuff to retain a little bit of moisture, but adding in the sand lets that stuff drain a little bit more naturally. But the biggest thing to do when you're talking about your soil composition is to figure out what it is that is ideal for the plant that you want to grow. So a good number of different wildflowers that prefer well draining soils. This is my preferred medium because you don't want it to just grow in sand. You don't want to have to be out there watering every single day. So with this, it does allow for a little bit of moisture retention, but not so much that your plants are going to be unhappy. You may have some rot or anything like that. It's a very solid medium. And that's kind of the biggest takeaway, is to make sure that whatever you're trying to grow, that you're putting it in the right medium. So that's my preferred thing. And, it's very easy to grab a couple bags of this or that, mix up your own medium, especially when you're on the scale of a container garden. Typically the scale is a lot smaller than a landscape. So you're able to add that sort of custom touch a lot easier because you're just looking to fill one pot as opposed to an entire yard. So a couple other mixes that, go back to the pine based mix. That's something that we do sell, is sort of the base composted pine. Very good. It's a composted material, very good at holding moisture. And that kind of broken down pine, the acidity is fairly good for quite a bit of our native species. So that's, again, what I prefer to do. If I do need something to drain a little bit easier and I don't have access to like a bag of sand, perlite is a good option as well, just to mix some of that in, aerate the soil a little bit. And again, depending on what it is that you're growing, you could also just stick with a standard sphagnum based mix. That, there's all different types of mixes, cactus mixes, everything under the sun. But really just keep in mind what your plant wants, the kind of conditions that it wants, so that you can kind of mimic it and give it the best opportunity to grow. And kind of going hand in hand with that, we've got the question on everyone's mind is, should I water or should I not? I believe Shakespeare wrote that quote. But there's a whole lot of factors that go into how often you should water, and it's something that I get asked a lot. That's kind of it's almost impossible to answer unless it's your own garden, because then you take care of it, kind of what your schedule is. But it's really hard to say this one plant water every X days, because any change in conditions can really make a difference. So sun exposure, temperature, wind, pot size and plant size, or essentially how big the roots are, how grown in the roots are, and what your plant actually wants, what it requires to grow happily, are all things that are going to affect your watering frequency. For me, I do have an exposure where when we do get those rains off of the water, if you saw in one of these other pictures, well, there you go. In the back there, you can see I do have a bay facing patio. Um, but that's one of the other things that I have as kind of a special perk, is that when it rains, I don't have to water my sunny plants. But in general, my sunny plants, I typically water every 1 to 3 days, depending. Generally early in the spring, when we do not have a whole lot of rains, but the temperature's starting to increase, that is something that I have to do fairly frequently, is every day or every other day, depending. My plants will get a little dry, so I'll have to go out and water. And my shade plants, they're in the shade, not as much heat, not as much wind exposure, so I don't have to water those as much. And they also don't have as much, well, some of them don't have as heavy of a watering requirement as well. So, and one other thing, because this happened to me personally, is if you do live on in an apartment on a balcony and that's where you're gardening, don't forget saucers. It was only about a week after I moved into this new apartment that I got a note taped to my door from my downstairs neighbors that said, "Hey, we really love plants too. We're so glad that you like plants, but every time you water, it just dumps onto our patio, and our dog likes to sit out there, and it's not really great when he comes in soaking wet because you're watering your plants. So so don't forget your saucers, or you may have some very grumpy downstairs neighbors. And the last thing, or not the last thing, I suppose, but one of the other important things, kind of going hand in hand again with what I've been saying is species selection. You want to make sure that what you're growing is not going to outgrow whatever you're trying to put it in, within reason. If that's something that you understand and that you are determined to take care of, then of course that's a different story. But generally, it's better not to fight the plants that you want to have. It's better to make sure that before you take care of it, that it's something that is going to be easy enough to take care of. And one of the things that I kind of use when I'm deciding what I want to grow is that I pick the pot and then I pick the plant, because especially on my patio, I have very confined space. So depending on how much space you have available to start your garden, you kind of have to save space. You may only have room for a couple of larger pots and then some smaller ones, or whatever. But you want to make sure that you've got enough space to facilitate the garden, so it's a lot more manageable. Don't want to make too much work for yourself. And another very, very, very important thing that I talk about a lot is root maintenance. I've gotten this question in the nursery. I've gotten this questions from relatives or whoever. That is, I've had a plant in a pot for years, for 20 years, and it's been perfect until now. And now I'm getting all these yellow leaves, and it dries out super quick, and I don't know what to do. And typically, if they bring that plant in, you just kind of take it out of the pot and you go, well, it's really root bound, so you gotta deal with that situation. So whenever you see a bunch of yellowing leaves, that's very uncharacteristic. Frequent heat exhaustion, or droopy leaves, the plant's kind of getting flaccid, it doesn't have enough moisture, then chances are it's root bound and needs to be repotted. Root pruning needs to be done. Things like that, just to make sure that they can continue to grow and stay happy. So I took the liberty of kind of going through the motions here as to what lies underneath, if you will. So a seemingly harmless grass here. Well, when you take it out of the pod, it looks pretty nasty. You got to do something with that. Plants like that don't have a lot of soil left in there. There's not enough room to hold a lot of the moisture every time it gets watered, so they dry out quicker. The plant is larger, it has more roots, so it requires more water. So the water that's in there is not sufficient. So you definitely want to treat that so that it can be happy again. So typically what I do, especially for something this bad, is I kind of cut out the frisbee, I like to call it, that bottom coiling of the roots. I just kind of chop that part off. I call it a frisbee because a lot of times they're so intact that you could throw it like a frisbee, and that's that. Um, you could use a little hand saw that I have there, a sharp knife or something, just to get up and break up a lot of that matting. And it's all important to make sure all the way around, bottom, top, sides, everything gets broken up, because when the new roots grow out, you want to make sure that they're stable. You want to make sure that they're not growing into one section of the pot. You want to make sure that everything's kind of growing out evenly, because then that itself can lead to problems later on. So cut off the frisbee. And then I just kind of put the plant on its side and start to slice up the side roots. And once that's done, I'll just kind of get in there with my hands and start to break apart and pull apart a lot of that matting on the sides, until you have something that looks a little bit more like that, a little bit more manageable. Now, you could always, if you have a larger pot, put that wholesale in a pot, be done with it. But in the case like this is a Fakahatchee grass, very easy to split up. So I took the liberty of just splitting it up. So I didn't leave a torn up 3-gallon Fakahatchee grass on the floor for someone to buy. So definitely very important, because a lot of times in pots, you're confining their root space. So it is something that you have to think about more often than not, especially with some of the Florida native plants. Some of these things grow relatively quickly and can really fill out the container that you put it in quick. So you want to make sure that you're kind of on top of it. Make less work for yourself. So the other plant considerations, I I had such a fun time with all these puns. Good gosh. If anyone, in Pinellas is close to the salt air, has some kind of salt exposure, making sure that you're selecting species that will tolerate that salt spray or the salt air. That's kind of a given. Just make sure your plants are going to be happy and can tolerate that kind of environment. Harsh winds, when we get a lot of winds, it's going to wick a lot of that moisture off of your pot and right out of it. So you want to just keep that into account. That may sort of bump up your watering frequency. Just another thing to be aware of. And pests and disease, typically with native plants, you'll find that the pests and disease are fairly minimal. But because it is slightly a different environment than just out in the wild or in a landscape, even where you've got more sort of natural control, especially with mine, I have some problems with airflow, especially in those little corners, my shade corners, I'll call them. So that is something that, every now and then I will have to deal with. And typically what I do is keep just a little spray bottle of neem and some garden friendly fungicide, just in case of emergency, I suppose. One other thing that I did not mention that was brought up, as you'll see, my sweet little cat Zelda there, is pets. And most, if not all, of the plants that I keep are pet friendly. Not toxic to animals. Although, if anyone has a good eye, you can see that she's currently sniffing a pot full of prickly pear cactus. I will assure you that I took this picture, and about 2 seconds afterwards, I threw my phone on the ground to nudge her away before she got like a needle and something bad. But that's also a consideration, making sure that anything doesn't have any seeds that are going to form, fruits that are going to form, that could potentially be toxic if you let your pets out onto the patio or inside this container garden, or anything like that. Or if they're just kind of leaf munchers, make sure you don't have anything that's going to be harmful. So from here on out, since we've kind of covered the basics, and of course, if there's any questions, anything else, feel free to ask. But from here on out, once you kind of understand those basic concepts, then you can start to go into kind of the fun, crunchy part, which is the species selection. I definitely have a lot of choices, obviously working at the nursery. And I do have some sort of inside sources. So I do like to grow as many cool things as I can find on my patio. So I think from here, we're going to talk about some of the specific species that I keep, as well as a couple more considerations. So wildflowers are definitely the first and easiest thing to grow in sunny areas, full apart sun, because generally they tend to be smaller plants, much more manageable in pots. So that is something that I have, quite a bit of. They're colorful. They're great for pollinators, especially when you have very limited space. It's nice to have what you have make an impact, make the biggest impact possible. So that's definitely one of the go-tos. So first one that I'll talk about is something I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with, the Stokes aster. This one is fairly easily kept in a pot, very small growing plants, typically only like 12 to 18 inches tall. And typically that's with the flower spike as well. They generally don't, the foliage does not get too tall. That picture on the left is my Stokes aster after about actually, this is the second year. So that's the second year's worth of growth. Typically they like a little bit more moisture, but still like it to be well draining. So that first soil mix that I showed with the pine and the sand is what I used for this. Watering, as with most of the full sun plants, it's typically about 1 to 3 days, like I mentioned, factoring in some of those other conditions. And it's a garden that you have to commit to when you plant out everything and when you have everything set up. It's something that you spend a lot of time in. So it's typically not something that's going to go unnoticed if a plant is thirsty and you need to adjust your watering schedule or what have you. So just something to keep in mind. Typically the season is in spring, although it seems like our blooms have been kind of all over the place recently. We've had some blooms over the winter time. We've got blooms coming now on some of the planted specimens at the nursery. So take it with a grain of sand. And sometimes container gardens can be a little bit different than how it would be in the ground, because again, you're controlling some of those environmental conditions like the soil, essentially nutrient availability, as well as the watering. There are periods where we're going to have more drought than others, and some plants react differently and postpone or bloom earlier or what have you. So it's all kind of relative. For me, this kind of happened in the spring. So far, I'm still waiting on the Stokes aster to bloom this year. And I do have the one shown on the right there, the white one, which is very cool. Very pretty stark white flower. So that's the first one. It's definitely easy. The blooms are big. They're gorgeous. Definitely a no-brainer for me. The next one, I am keeping a liatris as well. It is something, this species in particular, the tenuifolia, is a smaller growing species, a little bit more well-behaved in pots. So not going to grow nearly as tall, the 8-foot blooms that you might get on a mature spicata or something like that. It does prefer a very well-drained soil, dry, well-drained. So even upping the mixture of sand or even adding some additional perlite or something like that could give you a more appropriate medium to plant in. Again, watering is about 1 to 3 days. And the blooms, of course, those happen in the summer and the fall. These are definitely one of my favorite wildflowers. I love the purple blooms. I think the name is very pretty as well. But this one is something that is much more well behaved in pots than some of the other species. And there are other smaller growing species of liatris that seem to be infrequently available at the nursery. So that might be something that if it ever pops up, that could be your cue to grab that one for your garden. Another one that I have had great success with this year has been standing cypress. Again, this is something that we get infrequently, but when we do, it's definitely a go grab it kind of plant. Um, it generally grows about 2 to 4 feet tall in the containers. They are biennials, so you'll get a year of growth and a year of blooms. Um, the one that I had did bloom already, and it didn't grow very tall before it died back. So I will have to try again next year with some seed. Um, but they do like very well drained sandy soils. They're very drought tolerant. And drought tolerance is something that you can kind of take with a grain of sand, no pun intended, uh, because these are not plants that um, can grow to the same extent that they can in the ground. So something that you'll have to supplement. But they do make those gorgeous sort of honeysuckle type tubular flowers. Absolutely stunning. And the foliage is very thin, very wispy. Really nice, soft foliage, and it's just a really unique plant. So definitely something that I will collect seed for year after year, and grow, because it's definitely got a special place in my heart. Um, and speaking of a special place in my heart, another one of the ones that I have been completely enthusiastic over has been the celestial lily. This is an endangered species, and it is one that believe we came across through one of our fellow native nurseries in Green Isle Gardens. But this is one that, like I said, I've been completely enthralled with. Um, Generally, the foliage gets to about a foot tall, maybe a little bit taller, and then the flower stalks will come up another foot on top of that. And if you know this plant, you may know also that the blooms typically happen in a very narrow window, usually like August and September. And they open up in the late afternoon or early evening, generally about like 4 to 5 o'clock, which is really cool. And they've got those small little purple flowers. They call it celestial lily, but it's actually an iris. So, go figure. This is why common names are kind of, whatever, how you feel about them. But the number of blooms that I got even in my first year was astounding. It was something like, I think I counted 20 to 25 blooms on one single plant about that big. And it's just a very charming plant. This one, though, in contrast to all the other ones that we've talked about so far, tends to like a moister, richer soil. Still, because I am able to control that medium and I have it planted in something that retains more water, even though it's in the sun, I can still water it on the same schedule as everything else. Just because you're controlling that soil composition. So that's one of the things that makes container gardening easy once you kind of have the basics down, is that you can sort of just delineate sections of sun and shade, or at least in my case, you can, and then kind of set a watering schedule, because the soil that you've planted everything in kind of facilitates that. So again, every 1 to 3 days or every 1 to 4 days, it tends to stay moister than everything else. So sometimes I can skip a day. And then, of course, the season, the summer and fall. This one came up for its second year. It did die back in the winter time. And it has already been blooming. It's been blooming actually for about a month now. So it looks like the window started a little early, about a month. But again, just a super charming plant. One of those that, when you can find it, when you can get it, it's definitely something that I would encourage. Quite a cute little charming plant. And I've got another picture of it there with a little bit of rain on it. I think it's very cute. Blue-eyed grass is another one that I've had very good success with in a pot. This is another iris, not quite a grass, but generally doesn't get too tall, maybe to about a foot or so, maybe a little bit taller planted out. But again, in a pot, you're expecting a little bit less than what you would in the ground. The soil, it can be rich or poor. The one thing is that it really does need the moisture. So I tended to have a little bit of, I think at this point I had to add some vermiculated to this one, just to hold a little bit more moisture into it. But again, the watering schedule is about 1 to 3 days, and they bloom with those cute little iris flowers spring through summer. Definitely one of our showcase plants in the nursery in season, and something that I think goes a little bit underrated, landscape or in containers like this. Typically, they have those like bluish purple flowers, like the bottom right photo. Although the one that I got had a little bit of had more of a light purple color to it. So sometimes you see those variations, and I believe one of the batches that we brought in this past year had totally white flowers, which was very cool. So definitely something that is underrated. This one is one of those types of plants that will grow its roots out quite a bit and is very easy to split, and pot up and give to a friend or give as a gift, something like that. But definitely one of my favorites. And you get quite a bit of blooms out of this, a lot of color for the small little plant. So one of the things that I don't have too many of, because again, it's kind of the maintenance aspect. I tend to get very busy very quickly, working at the nursery, and I'm also a part-time student. So I don't have a whole lot of time to be out on my patio as much as I would like to. So I do keep plants like this to a minimum, although there are some that I really do like to have. And with the shrubs, as opposed to something like a wildflower, you're adding typically a bigger plant. Some of them have lusher foliage, just kind of adding a contrast to some of the other plants that you might have. Some of them might be flowering, very very obvious flowering plants. And again, kind of adds different levels, different textures to contrast with some of the other plants that you might have on your patio or in your garden. So one of my favorites is in this case, it's the dwarf type Simpson stopper. I did for a little bit because I had this crazy idea that I was going to be some kind of bonsai genius and keep larger type plants on some sort of pruning schedule, foliage and the roots on some kind of pruning schedule. So I did keep a full size Simpson stopper in a pot for quite a while, and that did not turn out very well. Very quickly outgrew the pot that it was in. So when the nursery brought in the dwarf type Simpson stopper, that was something that was very easy to pick up and plant out. So typically the dwarf one gets only to about 36 inches tall, about 3 feet. And with Simpson stoppers, typically well-drained soils, but they can also do like it if every so often they get a little extra moisture. Definitely helps them grow quicker. Again, watering every 1 to 3 days. I have noticed that recently it is something that I will water every 2 days or so if I don't get rain, because it is getting to the point where the pot that I put it in was too small to begin with. So I will have to get a bigger pot, probably do some root pruning and repot it. Oh, my cat wants to say hello. You can say hello to everyone. There we go. Okay. So with the Simpson stopper, the whole idea is that I wanted to have those fragrant blooms very close to us when we would sit out on our patio, be able to smell the fragrance. Also, the berries are very showy later on in the year. So, it's one of the favorite plants at the nursery, regardless, because it is what it is. It's very popular, but something I wanted to try and include in my container garden. And the other one is the scrub blueberry, or the Darrow's blueberry, or little blueberry, or whatever you prefer. And this one is also a crowd pleaser, just because it has such a unique foliage color for the new growth. It's that very bright purple, blue, pink. I mean, you get just such a spectrum of those colors that comes through. Very, very popular. Has those cute little blueberry bell flowers on them, and of course followed up by fruits when they get pollinated. These plants don't typically get more than about 3 feet tall or wide, and they're very slow growing. So it's something that is very manageable. in a container. So the one thing that we always tell people, especially when you're planting it in the ground, is that they're very slow to establish roots. So watering is a very frequent task. So when you're incorporating it into your, new or already existing container gardening, that's something you're already thinking about, is the watering frequency. So it's not like you have to pay special attention to it. You just keep it on the same schedule as everything else. And again, every 1 to 3 days or so. And then the bloom period is usually in that spring and summer, as well as the fruit. And you get enough. They're wonderfully delicious fruits, very floral in the flavor of the blueberries, and definitely one of the most showy foliage plants that you can find in the sun. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea in the sunlight. And I mean, the world is your oyster. The plants are your oyster. There's so many different species that you could grow because you're able to control all of these factors. It's you kind of need to adhere to certain types of plants if you're planning out, an entire landscape, or plan on doing extra work or modifying the environment, your planting medium or whatnot on a larger scale. So having one little pot that can facilitate something from a very swampy or moist environment is going to be much easier than if you were to try and put it in a landscape. So even if your plan was to devote a small section of your yard or on your patio or something to species that are very hard to have in the ground, that's definitely something that I would encourage, because again, it's species diversity. You want to keep as many different things there as possible, and it really just turns out to be less effort in the end when you have sort of a special area for those types of plants. And then we go back to our shady characters. So kind of like I said before, different types of succulents or air plants, ferns, vines. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that you can actually pull off in shady areas. And again, typically with shady plants, you have less care. They don't grow as fast. So less root pruning, less pruning in general. And water and maintenance, kind of like I've been saying. And some of these can also be grown indoors if that's your thing. If you wanted to bring any of these plants inside, depending on the plant, that's definitely something that's possible. So the first thing I mentioned is the peperomias. Very easy to grow. In the wild, they're epiphytic, so they don't typically grow terrestrially in the ground. They grow on top of moist, fallen logs, on trees or things like that. So that lends them to being extremely easy to take care of, thriving on the neglect, as people say. So we have a number of species of peperomias. Typically, the most common you'll see are the obtusifolia, the humistrata, which respectively. So those are definitely very easy, very rich foliage plants. And I know it looks like my humistrata there is my fuzzy peperomia is a little sad with the droopy leaves, but it was at that point, it was in a small pot and I had grown it for long enough. I needed to take it out and do a little bit of pruning on it. So very easy to grow, not something that you really have to water a whole lot. Typically, they're kind of fine on their own. Since I do water everything else in that area, I do dump a little bit of water on them and they seem to grow and be happier. But if you are going to put it in a soil medium, you want to put it in something that's fairly rich. So when it does require the moisture, it's already there. Typically watering, I say every 3 to 6 days. Like I said, I just kind of end up watering this because it's there when I water everything else in the shade areas. So maybe you don't even have to water it on that schedule or at all, depending on where you put it. But definitely a really nice plant, rich foliage. Definitely something that's very easy to grow, good for beginners. Flowering is not really anything extraordinary. They have these little spike things that they put up. Can't really see it very well in this photo on the left, but very easy to grow. This I am very excited about. This was one of the most recent additions to the garden, and this is the swamp leather flower, or Clematis crispa. This one is again. I'm just excited about it. Um, it was one of the things that I didn't really have a whole lot of interesting things going on in my shade area. And once we brought this plant in, I knew it was perfect. And one way or another, I ended up with this cool little driftwood tree, and I had the idea for a long time that I wanted something growing on it. So I tried a couple different plants. Nothing really ever worked. And then the second this plant came in, I said, "Oh crap, that's the one. That's the one that's going to work." So I got it in a very rich mix because it likes to stay wet, and planted it out. Uh, Pulled apart some of the trailers and had them sort of crawling around the tree, and then I just let it go from there. And this one has been blooming pretty much nonstop since it was planted out. Has those cute little bell flowers, and my cat really wants to say hi, so I guess she can hang out. So this is one that if you do have that shady area, I would absolutely encourage. It's definitely one of my recent favorites. It can trail up to a decent length. So if you do have a larger area, you can definitely let it kind of do everything that it wants to. But as long as you keep it in a moist environment in the shade, it is something that's going to treat you very well. And this one goes through spring and summer for its bloom. So we're most likely nearing the end of the bloom cycle for this one. And I do believe that it dies back. So I'm going to keep it there and wait for it to come back out next spring and get it to grow on that tree again. So the next one is one of our ferns. This is our native shield fern, Philopteris. And oh my goodness, Zelda, sweetheart. She really just likes to say hi a lot. And this goes with many, if not all of our ferns, that they should be very easy to keep. With a few exceptions, things that are a little bit more aggressive, like our Nephrolepsis, the sword ferns, or any of the larger growing ferns. Not very good candidates for this, but the shield fern is typically a smaller growing fern. And kind of the world's, again, your oyster. You can pick whatever is more manageable in pots. But ferns are definitely very rich foliage plants, very easy to keep. Shade, moisture, and you should be good. So definitely one of those that I like to keep. Tillandsias, those are another one that are again very easy. The bromeliads, typically not a whole lot of watering with these guys, if any. Sometimes if it's really, really dry, you may need to go out with like a spray bottle and spritz them just to get something on them, but generally you don't have to do anything to them. Growth habits, there's a bunch of different species of Tillandsia, a little bit above my pay grade to be able to identify them because some of them look very similar. But again, no regular watering. And the season, depending on what it is, may bloom. During the year, I've had bromeliads that have never bloomed, and I've had for years and years and years. Like that one in the green, or the larger green one there, and I've kind of got a sob story about that. I've had that since I started gardening. I got my first job gardening these native yards, and my boss gave me a little tiny air plant, and I kept it for years, and I had it on a little plank of wood, and it grew and it got big. And then when I moved to this apartment, one day I came out and it was just completely rotted out from the center, and it was full of water. So somehow or another it filled with water, possibly when I was watering everything else. I accidentally got some water in there and it did not like it, but it was a very sad day for me. But very easy plant to keep, especially if you had something like this kind of driftwood piece or anything that you could stick some of these air plants on. All you really have to do is stick them there and they'll live. So very easy to grow. And last but not least, the one that I wanted to another one I wanted to highlight is our wild columbine. Now this is a very extreme what I'll call native species. This one is a very far northern Florida native. But again, it kind of can go and show you how the kind of range of different plants that you can keep if you are able to control them in pots. So this is something that doesn't get very big, grows to about 1 to 2 feet tall. It is also a biennial like the standing cypress. So first year it's going to grow, second year it'll bloom. Typically well-drained soils, it can generally handle a good bit of drought. But it's something that I tend to keep watered with all the other shade plants, typically every 2 to 4 days. The bloom time is usually in the spring, summer, and it has one of those really, really, really unique flowers on them. And I wish I could kind of zoom that in, but it's such a cool, unique flower that it's one of those plants that once we got a hold of, I definitely wanted to grow. This year's been very different because the first year it did not die back in the wintertime. It stayed green all year. It had a little bit of dieback. I'd call it semi-deciduous is what it looked like. Grew back out in the spring, flushed out, and about a month ago, it just completely died back. And seems like I've heard a couple different things of it's supposed to die back in the wintertime. It's supposed to die back in the summer and then come back up. Though it hasn't bloomed yet. So it's still a pot of dirt right now. And I'm kind of afraid to touch the soil because I'm not sure what's going on. So it's going to hang out for a little bit. But again, just one of those cool plants that I like to highlight because I try to keep it as unique as possible on in my garden. So kind of just to wrap up, it's definitely with native plants, there's a whole lot to learn and a lot that you can figure out just by experimenting, trying new things, being creative, and just really bringing that personal touch to your container garden, adding different, what I like to call yard art, different types of metal sculptures or paintings or what have you, really making that garden your own. Not just with the plants that you keep, but also, the sort of personality that you bring with it. So I always like to experiment with new species, especially when they're new and exciting. And, we don't get them very frequently to sell through the nursery. That's definitely something that I like to do. This talk was all about natives, but of course, mixing them with different herbs or succulents or other types of plants that you can keep in pots is always, a good thing. One of the things that I always had fun with, especially with my fiance, is we would when we get new plants, we would always hand paint the pots. And I'm not an artist. I generally think I'm the opposite of that. I'm pretty bad with my artistic talents, but it's something that can help bring that sort of personal touch to your garden. Different stands, keep things on different levels. Really just experiment and have fun, is the key takeaway. It's something that's not on quite as large a scale as a landscape might be. So you're able to spend more time on it, I think, and have more of a personal touch. So that's kind of where I'm at. And maybe next year I'll be able to take some new pictures and do another talk on the progress of the garden. And maybe I'll have a couple new species to talk about. But that is what I had for you guys, and I'm wondering if anyone has any questions. I should stop sharing my screen here. There we go.
I wanted to let everybody know that the setting is now on, so that if you want to unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your questions, or you can use the little hand raising feature down at the bottom in your toolbar from Zoom. We can work it that way, or if you would prefer, you can certainly type your question into the chat as well, and then Davis can read it and answer for you. All right, we got one from Ginger. Ginger wanted to know, does Wilcox sell the recommended types of potting mixes that you showed in your presentation?
Yeah, most of them. The first one that I showed, like I said, I'm a little privileged because that's a kind of a proprietary company mix that we get delivered specifically for our own potting. But if you wanted to create basically the same mix, all it is about 80% of that composted pine, which we do sell, and we call that our Jolly Gardener mix. Um, and then just mixing in, like I said, about 20% sand. That's kind of what that is, basically. So I'm not really sure where to tell you that you can get, sand for that kind of a mix. But at least the base of the soil, that compost pine, is that Jolly Gardener, and we do sell that.
Velma actually had a quick follow-up question to that topic, and she was wondering what type of sand do you use in your mixes? And just because she had heard that some are more or less appropriate for certain settings, is there like a mineral content that you're looking for, or just like playground, that white clay sand?
The short answer is yes, and the long answer is I'm not exactly sure. There are certain types of sand that are sort of meant for that, meant for horticulture use, or for planting plants in. And then there's also other types of sand that are more for like construction and those types of uses. So it's not exactly with plants in mind. That would be something definitely to consult the extension about. Like I said, unfortunately, I don't have that information in front of me, and I don't want to give you any wrong information. But the answer, like I said, is yes. There are certain sands mixes that I would stay away from because they are not meant. They're meant for other things, I should say.
All right, we have another question about creating a bog type container garden. So what advice would you have for like a mini wetland habitat? That's a really good question.
Yeah. If you're doing it in containers, depending on the kind of plants, I guess you may or may not want to consider some kind of a liner. Um, I don't know that I would totally consider any of the plants that I'm keeping that are more wetland type plants to be anything that you'd want to keep a liner in, but I could see you using some kind of larger basin or even smaller ones and just having some kind of a liner to keep the moisture in. You could probably grow stuff like duck potato, um, different kinds of mallows. And actually, that is one that I don't know if I had a picture in my presentation. That is one that I just started keeping on my patio. Was one of our native mallows, um, the Poe Pig's rose mallow. But potentially, picking a mix that's going to stay very wet, like that composted pine, and maybe even considering using an even richer composted material, like a manure, cow manure or mushroom compost or something like that, to kind of add more richness on top of that. And then just kind of see where it goes. If you plant something out like that and it's not happy, it seems like it needs more moisture, then you may consider some kind of a liner to line a larger pot, so that it can stay happy. Otherwise, I don't have the luxury of having space, but if you had larger containers, like larger barrels, I'm sure people would use like old tubs or something to that nature, that you could definitely do kind of a larger scale container garden, with a larger liner and keeping stuff like that. But plants like Scarlet's rose mallow or the scarlet hibiscus is definitely one of the fan favorites for moisture environments. And I did keep one of those on my patio for for at least a season. I did get a couple blooms out of it. But that is one that I had to be out there pretty much every day to water. Otherwise I wasn't happy. So potentially doing some kind of a liner, something to keep that moisture in. Or there are several different types of amendments, like, I can't think of the name of it now. Anyways, they're the types of amendments that'll keep the moisture in the soil. Would be an option for that.
All right, thank you.
Oh yeah. Actually, I that might have been Jan that said that, or whoever.
Yeah, probably.
But yes, yes to all of those. Those would all be fantastic additions to a bog garden. Um, and I've noticed I also have an eryngium on that on the patio. It's the eryngium yuccifolium. The oh goodness, I started forgetting common names because I've developed such a elitist disdain for them. Uh, uh, but the button rattlesnake master, that's what it's called. That one is one that I did have to put some extra vermiculite in, and it still doesn't seem to be happy on my sunny watering schedule. Um, so kind of like I've been saying, potentially that modified wetland area with some kind of a liner or something would be the best choice for that.
Um, so Velma is asking, which I'm sure a lot of us are probably having a similar thought. Is there a way for you to post a list of the plants that you spoke about this evening, or maybe like on the Facebook page, or just I'm wondering if maybe she's wanting to know, especially like just kind of a sorted list for light requirements, possibly. She
Sure.
can chime in on that. I'm making an assumption there.
Yeah. Velma, I don't know if you wanted to clarify. Um, but yeah, no, I mean, I can absolutely make a list available. I could even, I don't know if the actually making the PowerPoint available to you would be a better solution. Because
Sure, and then also just to let everyone know, this is recorded, so we will put it, I believe, on our chapter channel for members on YouTube.
good, yeah, absolutely. I can take, in the PowerPoint. I also put in, like I said, that's my personal like watering schedule and my kind of abridged plant specifications. So some of that might turn out to be different when you actually plant out your own garden. But at least if it's a good template for people to get started, yeah, absolutely, I can make it available.
Now, member Kathy would like to know about the plants that were annuals versus perennials and things. I think you discussed a couple of different options in your list for things that die back and then come back after, die back in the winter and then come back after, is what she was asking about.
Yeah. Typically I don't keep annuals. Um, some of them, some of the plants I do have that are annuals or of that nature where they will die out and that's it. You'll just have to start them over from seed. Like I said, it tends to be, especially when I kind of let my garden get away and I have a lot of plants, a little bit too labor intensive for me to keep. So any of the plants that I mentioned, let me see, like the celestial lily is going to be a deciduous plant, so it'll die back and come back in the winter or come back in the spring. Um, I've been told that Stokes aster is a plant like that, but then again, I feel like the last couple of years there's been no dieback, so that one's kind of up in the air. The blazing stars as well are supposed to be deciduous, but this I guess with a grain of salt. Some of these plants in containers tend to act differently than planted out in the ground, but any of the plants that I spoke about today, none of them are, quote unquote annuals. They're going to at least keep that root, keep the roots alive, die back to the roots, and then start growing out new foliage in the spring. So the clematis is one of those, um, potentially the columbine, but that one will die out after 2 years. So, well, Hillary and I have finally spent some time creating the first of hopefully a long running series on our YouTube page about cooking with native plants and actually going through the recipes and showing you guys how you can actually cook with them. I will be putting a teaser out for that series tomorrow on our Facebook. an Instagram, and our email blast. And that series is set to air towards the end of the month. So it sounds like it was very well received. So if you guys were interested in more of that kind of content, that should be coming very soon.
So, well, David, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. I hope everyone got their questions answered, but if not, you can always reach out to us at info@PinellasNativePlants.com.